Michael Caine once admitted something about Jaws the Revenge that might be the most honest thing any actor has ever let slip. He confessed he'd never actually watched the movie, and that by all accounts, it was terrible. But the house it paid for turned out terrific. That single sentence captures everything about Hollywood's 3-decade addiction to spin-offs and sequels that absolutely nobody requested. From the late 70s through the mid-2000s, studios pumped out follow-up after follow-up to beloved movies, banking on the idea that a familiar title on the poster mattered more than a decent screenplay. Some of these films hemorrhaged tens of millions of dollars, some collected Razzies, and a few managed to do both at the same time. Today we're counting down 15 of the most unnecessary, ill-conceived, and flat-out baffling movie spin-offs ever released, and we're breaking down exactly what went wrong with each one. If you love looking back at the movies that shaped your childhood, even the ones that probably never should have existed, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's get into it. Number 15. Grease 2, 1982. 4 years after Grease became a cultural phenomenon, Paramount went back to Rydell High without John Travolta, without Olivia Newton-John, and without any clear reason to revisit the place. An almost entirely new cast carried this sequel, which landed on an $11 million budget and scraped together roughly $15 million at the box office. Compare that to the original's $132 million domestic, and the gap tells its own story. What makes this one worth remembering is the career fallout. Michelle Pfeiffer landed her first starring role in this movie and went on to become one of the biggest names of the next 2 decades. But her co-star Maxwell Caulfield described the flop as something that set his career back a full 10 years. Roger Ebert summed things up by saying the film just recycled the original without the stars, without the energy, and without the grease. Over the decades, though, Grease 2 picked up a genuinely devoted cult following built almost entirely around its campy charm and a couple of surprisingly catchy musical numbers. Number 14. Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles, 2001. 13 years had passed since the second Crocodile Dundee film, and the fish-out-of-water premise had long since dried up. Paul Hogan dusted off the hat one more time for a $25 million production that scraped together roughly $39 million worldwide, the weakest gross in the franchise by a wide margin. Rotten Tomatoes sits at 11%, and critics agreed that audiences had already seen every joke this movie attempted. A Razzie nomination for Worst Remake or Sequel followed, which felt about right. What really stands out, though, is that this turned out to be the final acting role for Linda Kozlowski, Hogan's co-star and real-life wife, who later admitted that the quality of scripts coming her way had been giving her an ulcer. Number 13. Dumb and Dumberer, When Harry Met Lloyd, 2003. A textbook case study in what happens when you build a follow-up without involving a single person from the original. Bobby and Peter Farrelly stayed away. Jim Carrey stayed away. Jeff Daniels stayed away. And New Line Cinema pressed ahead regardless, with a prequel set during the characters' high school years, directed by Troy Miller and starring Derek Richardson alongside Eric Christian Olsen. $19 million went into the budget, and about $39 million came back worldwide, which sounds almost passable until you stack it against the original's $247 million. Rotten Tomatoes holds it at 10% with an average score of 2.8 out of 10, and the consensus boiled down to 3 words: rent the original instead. When Carrey and Daniels eventually reunited for Dumb and Dumber 2 in 2014, it functioned as a quiet admission that the prequel never should have happened. Number 12. Look Who's Talking Now, 1993. Nearly $300 million worldwide on a $7.5 million budget. That's what the original Look Who's Talking pulled in back in 1989. By the time the third installment rolled around, the filmmakers had burned through the talking baby concept and pivoted to talking dogs, voiced by Danny DeVito and Diane Keaton. Bruce Willis, the voice behind the baby in the first 2 films, didn't come back. What followed ranks among the most dramatic franchise collapses on record. $22 million went into production, and roughly $10 million trickled back worldwide, representing a 96% drop from the original. Rotten Tomatoes registers 0%. Gene Siskel called it abysmal and embarrassing, and the franchise died right there without anyone stepping forward to mourn it. Number 11. Staying Alive, 1983. Here's where the list takes an unexpected turn, because Staying Alive actually earned money, and a lot of it. Roughly $127 million worldwide, off a $22 million budget, landed it in the top 10 for 1983. But here's the thing, it might also be the most critically savage commercial hit of the entire decade. Saturday Night Fever was gritty, raw, and rated R, a genuine cultural landmark that captured something real about its era. Staying Alive turned all of that into a sanitized PG underdog story directed by Sylvester Stallone, who basically rebuilt the concept as Rocky with dance numbers. John Travolta returned, trained for 5 months, and dropped 20 pounds, but virtually nobody else from the original came along. Frank Stallone's songs replaced the Bee Gees' iconic presence, which tells you everything about the creative priorities at work. Roger Ebert compared the finished product to a car commercial that had gotten sick to its stomach, and the Rotten Tomatoes score sits at 0%, making it the oldest film on the platform to carry that distinction. So yes, it turned a profit, but it remains one of the clearest examples of commercial success and creative integrity sprinting in opposite directions. Number 10. The Flintstones in Viva Rock Vegas, 2000. $358 million worldwide. That's what the 1994 Flintstones movie pulled in. Universal went back to bedrock for a prequel that nobody had asked for, and the casting process told its own cautionary tale before cameras even rolled. John Goodman reportedly declined to return because he feared getting typecast. Rick Moranis had already stepped away from acting, and without them, the studio recast with Mark Addy, Stephen Baldwin, Kristen Johnston, and Jane Krakowski. $83 million went into the budget, and just under $60 million came back worldwide. 4 Razzie nominations arrived, including Worst Picture, though the film lost across the board to Battlefield Earth. And tucked inside this otherwise forgettable prequel sits a small piece of trivia worth knowing. A young Kristen Stewart appears in an early, uncredited role as a ring toss girl. Number 9. Supergirl, 1984. After 3 Superman films, the Caine producers decided the franchise needed a female lead, and the concept wasn't inherently doomed. What doomed it was the execution. Christopher Reeve declined to appear, which meant the original subplot where Supergirl rescues Superman had to be gutted and completely rewritten. Mark McClure as Jimmy Olsen ended up being the only returning cast member from the Superman series. $35 million of budget translated into roughly $14 million domestic, the lowest gross the Superman franchise had ever recorded. Test audiences found it overlong, and the studio chopped 30 minutes from the running time for North American release. Peter O'Toole collected a Razzie nomination for Worst Actor. Faye Dunaway picked up one for Worst Actress, and the film's failure convinced the Caines to sell the Superman rights entirely. It later earned a spot in the official Razzie Movie Guide among the 100 most enjoyably bad movies ever committed to film. Number 8. Blues Brothers, 2000, 1998. Lightning in a bottle, that's the only honest description of the original Blues Brothers. A collision of Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, a killer soundtrack, legendary musical cameos, and anarchic energy that couldn't be manufactured. By 1998, Belushi had been dead for 16 years, and none of that magic could be reassembled. Universal greenlit the sequel on a $31 million budget, with Aykroyd returning to co-write the script. John Goodman stepped in alongside Joe Morton and a 10-year-old child sidekick, and that casting choice tells you exactly where things went sideways. The studio forced a family-friendly PG-13 retool that pushed away the adult audience who loved the original, and the result was roughly $14 million domestic alongside about $32 million worldwide. Aykroyd later conceded that the studio's criticism landed, acknowledging the script amounted to a carbon copy of the first film stripped of its spark. A planned third Blues Brothers movie never came together. Number 7. Exorcist II: The Heretic, 1977. Warner Brothers handed the Exorcist sequel to director John Boorman, a man who openly disliked the original and set out to create what he described as an anti-exorcist, a metaphysical art film built around locust swarms and hypnosis machines rather than demonic terror. The original stands as one of the most terrifying and culturally significant horror films ever produced, which made this creative direction feel like a deliberate provocation. Production turned into its own kind of horror story. Boorman contracted valley fever and shut everything down for a month. The imported locusts kept dying in batches, the editor quit, and 2 cast members developed gallbladder infections during the shoot. Audience response landed so badly that Boorman went back and re-edited the ending the day after the premiere. And yet this entry fascinates more than almost any other on the list, because it has genuine defenders. Martin Scorsese praised it publicly. Pauline Kael admired its visual ambition, and it now occupies that rare space where a film gets called one of the worst ever made and a misunderstood artistic gamble in the same breath. Number 6. Caddyshack II, 1988. One of the most quotable comedies of the 80s, and the sequel lost nearly everyone responsible for making it work. Rodney Dangerfield reportedly threw the script in the trash when the studio refused his requested changes. Bill Murray passed in favor of making Scrooged, and Ted Knight had already passed away, which left Chevy Chase as the lone returning star, a decision he later expressed regret about. Harold Ramis held a story credit and tried to get his name pulled from the project entirely. His description of the test screening tells you everything. He recalled crawling out of the theater on his hands and knees because he didn't want anyone to recognize him leaving. Razzies for Worst Supporting Actor and Worst Original Song followed, along with a nomination for Worst Picture. Caddyshack 2 became shorthand for what goes wrong when you chase comedy magic without the people who created it in the first place. Number 5. Jaws 3D and Jaws the Revenge. We're doubling up here because the Jaws franchise produced not one but 2 legendary misfires within 4 years of each other. Jaws 3D relocated the action to SeaWorld and handed the director's chair to Joe Alves, the series production designer stepping into his first and only feature. Roy Scheider refused to come back, reportedly insisting that not even the devil could talk him into it. $18 million of budget leaned heavily on the 3D pop-out gimmick, and while the film earned roughly $88 million worldwide, those effects looked absurd once the movie hit home video. 5 Razzie nominations landed, and Rotten Tomatoes holds it at around 10%. Jaws the Revenge arrived 4 years later, produced in under 9 months, a fraction of the time the earlier entries required. 23 million went in, and about 52 million came back worldwide, accompanied by a 2% Rotten Tomatoes score. And this is the film that gave us the Michael Caine quote we opened with. Caine missed collecting his Oscar for Hannah and Her Sisters in person because the Jaws shoot kept him in the Bahamas, which tells you something about where Hollywood's priorities sat during this period. Number 4. Highlander II, The Quickening. No production story on this list matches the chaos surrounding this one. Highlander underperformed in American theaters but built a massive cult following on home video, which created just enough financial justification for a sequel and just enough rope for everyone involved to hang themselves with. Filming took place in Argentina, where hyperinflation sent the studio rental skyrocketing from $300,000 to $10 million. The completion bond company eventually seized control of the production, re-edited the film without director Russell Mulcahy's input, and delivered the infamous version where the immortals turned out to be aliens from a planet called Zeist, a twist that contradicted everything the original had established. Sean Connery reportedly collected about $3.5 million for 9 days of work, while Christopher Lambert and the remaining cast finished only because their contracts demanded it. $15.5 million domestic against a budget that ballooned from $14 to $34 million, that's where the numbers landed. Roger Ebert awarded half a star. Mulcahy released a director's cut in 1995 that stripped out the Zeiss material, and critics consider it a noticeable improvement, though clearing that bar didn't require much effort. Number 3. Speed 2 Cruise Control, 1997. Speed worked as a perfect action movie because the premise was simple, tight, and relentless. A bus that can't slow down. The sequel relocated the action to a cruise ship, which is, and there's no getting around this, one of the slowest vehicles on the planet. Keanu Reeves recognized the problem immediately and walked away from an $11 million payday, explaining that a cruise ship moves even slower than a bus, and he just couldn't bring himself to do it. He picked the devil's advocate instead, and Fox reportedly froze him out of projects for close to a decade as retaliation. Sandra Bullock returned for $11 million, a leap from the $500,000 she'd earned for the original, and used her leverage to get Fox to finance her passion project, Hope Floats. She's been candid about regretting the decision since. Production started with a budget just under $100 million that reportedly ballooned to as high as $160 million, and the worldwide gross of roughly $165 million barely covered the negative cost before marketing enters the picture. Rotten Tomatoes holds it at 4%, and the Razzie for Worst Remake or Sequel followed right behind. Number 2. Elektra and Son of the Mask, both 2005. 2005 delivered a rare double feature of spin-off disasters, and they share the same fatal flaw. Both lost the star who anchored the original, and both paid for it at every level. Elektra grew out of 2003's Daredevil with Jennifer Garner in the lead, reportedly returning only because her contract from the first film forced her hand. Her then-boyfriend stated publicly that she'd called him and described the movie as awful. A reported budget of $43 million, with some estimates running as high as $65 million, produced just over $56 million worldwide, and a dismal $24 million domestic. Rotten Tomatoes registers around 10%. Leaked Sony emails revealed Marvel CEO Ike Perlmutter calling the project a very bad idea with a very, very bad result, and a planned Ben Affleck cameo as Daredevil ended up cut from the finished film. Son of the Mask attempted to continue the Mask franchise after Jim Carrey walked away, citing a negative experience on Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. Jamie Kennedy stepped into the lead role, carrying a budget somewhere between $84 and $100 million. Roughly $60 million returned worldwide, with only $17 million of that coming from domestic theaters. For context, the original Mask pulled in about $352 million on a budget of $18 to $23 million. 6% on Rotten Tomatoes, plus a Razzie win for Worst Remake or Sequel, and one reviewer admitted it was the closest he'd ever come to walking out of a movie halfway through. Number 1. Catwoman, 2004. And here it is, the crown jewel of unnecessary spin-offs. The film so spectacularly misguided that its lead actress showed up to accept her, Razzie holding her Oscar in the other hand. Catwoman originated as a spin-off from Tim Burton's Batman Returns, with Michelle Pfeiffer attached in the early stages. What followed was nearly a decade of development hell, cycling through multiple scripts while Ashley Judd and Nicole Kidman both circled the project at different points. Warner Brothers eventually fast-tracked production with Halle Berry after canceling a planned Batman vs. Superman film. Berry's deal paid $12.5 million against 10% of the gross. $100 million went into the budget, and $82 million came back worldwide, split roughly between $40 million domestic and $42 million international. A financial disaster by every available measure. 7 nominations arrived at the 25th Golden Raspberry Awards, and 4 converted into wins: Worst Picture, Worst Director, Worst Actress, and Worst Screenplay. Berry attended in person, Oscar in one hand and Razzie in the other, and thanked Warner Brothers for casting her in a god-awful movie, adding that it was exactly what her career needed since she'd been at the top and Catwoman sent her straight to the bottom. Bad test screenings had already forced last-minute reshoots that killed a planned IMAX release, and the finished product bore almost no resemblance to the character audiences knew from the comics or from Pfeiffer's earlier performance. And in one of Hollywood's stranger ironies, Catwoman held the record as the highest-grossing female-led superhero film until Wonder Woman arrived in 2017. Sometimes being the only option counts as its own kind of victory. Conclusion. So what does 3 decades of unwanted spin-offs actually teach us? The pattern repeats with stubborn consistency. Lose the original star, and audiences recognize a cash grab instantly. Betray the tone of what people loved, whether that means softening and rated comedy for families, converting a horror film into a philosophy lecture, or putting an action franchise on a vehicle that barely moves. And you lose the audience that showed up in the first place. And when the budget spirals, because nobody running the production can agree on what the movie is supposed to be, even a decent gross turns into a catastrophic write-down. Studios kept greenlighting these films because the math told them franchise titles carried less risk than original ideas, and on average, that math held up. But averages hide the outliers, and the outliers are where the real stories live. In development hell? In stars walking away from $11 million paychecks? In directors crawling out of test screenings on their hands and knees? And in one very honest British actor who never bothered watching his own shark movie but thoroughly enjoyed the house it bought him. Thanks for watching. If you stuck around this long, you clearly appreciate a good Hollywood train wreck. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.